Another good strategy in there was the SALT cap, which basically said if you're one of these wealthy people who votes for Democrats who have high state income taxes and all these high taxes, you can no longer deduct those taxes above $10,000, which was a cutoff for the super rich in those places, against your federal taxes, because all these rich people would back these Democrats and they'd vote for these higher taxes in these left-leaning cities, left-leaning states, and then they would use that as a deduction against their federal taxes. The Trump administration said, no, if you're going to vote for taxes in your local economies, in your state economies, then you should actually pay the consequences of what you vote for rather than deduct that from the federal government's take.
I'm sorry, do you think that people ended up paying more in SALT taxes that were earning more than it would have been enough income to, what was the cutoff, $10,000 in state and local tax liabilities? Do you think that those people ended up paying more in taxes when you take into account the federal tax cuts that Trump had?
I think, well, some of them did pay more in taxes for sure. And a lot of them moved in order to avoid it because they didn't want to live under the policies that they had helped and advocated for. This is why a lot of these people moved in there. So I actually think that was a smart policy. And again, you have to pay for your city's taxes if you're going to vote for your city and lobby and support politicians that have higher city taxes or higher state taxes. So I think that was a good policy, because if you have a no income tax state like the great state of Texas, then you should enjoy the benefits of that and not have the federal government subsidize these blue cities and blue states that do the opposite. So I think
doesn't the federal government send more money? Isn't there more subsidies going to red states and red areas? By definition, blue places just tend to be more economically prosperous than large cities.
The trick that a lot of people will use is they'll cite like the state of Kentucky and say, look at all the federal dollars going in there. But the state of Kentucky has Fort Knox, and those federal dollars included for those military bases count in the federal government spending in terms of the accounting. Fort Knox has like something like 10,000 soldiers in it. It's where we keep all our gold.
I'm sorry, do you think the majority of the disproportionate spending on red states is for military bases?
A lot of it is related to military bases.
You notice you never answer a question? A lot of it? Do you think there aren't military bases in blue states?
It depends on the state. But
are there military bases in blue states?
Is there a base like Fort Knox in a state that is blue that's comparable in size?
Is Fort Knox accounting for the disproportionate amount of money spent in every single red state in the United States?
A lot of red states are sparsely populated, so larger military bases in those states, yes, are going to be disproportionate in terms of spending.
Wouldn't the sparse population of a state contribute to its lack of economic contribution to federal funds? Isn't that the whole reason why red states tend to need more? Like all you're doing is making an argument because they don't have many people.
Because it would be what they're paying into taxes. We would grade based on a per capita basis. Obviously, would we not? Like we would account for their population in that metric.
Don't people on military bases pay taxes?
Sure, but the federal spending in terms of raw dollar amount in a state with a smaller population is going to represent a bigger portion of that state's GDP. Like this is like basic mathematics.
Well, you're using a phenomenal conspiracy theory to
It's not a conspiracy theory.
It is. The ultra well understood economic theory is that cities, not saying good or bad, cities are always more economically prosperous.
I didn't say
they're
they
always generating more. You're trying to make it sound like the lower amount of total citizens in a state is going to mean that a higher percentage of federal funds are spent on the military bases, and that's going to account for the difference in subsidization of those states. That's exactly what your argument is.
You're completely misunderstanding.
What did I just say that was wrong about your argument?
If you're spending on a military base a fixed amount of the defense budget in a particular state that is sparsely populated, then that fixed amount is going to represent a bigger percentage of their GDP as compared to their tax rates than it would in a larger state like California. My point is basic math. You're just trying to go end around to argue just to argue.
The point isn't basic math because
yes, it is basic math.
You don't even know how many military bases are in these states. You're hedging this whole argument on the assumption that I don't know the number of military personnel in every state.
Kentucky is often used as an example.
I'm not using Kentucky as an example.
Well, that's great. Kentucky is often used, not by you in this moment. Like I'm not saying you just said that. I didn't hear that from you. Do I need to clarify that anymore?
No, it's just a Kentucky's often like one-off argument. I happen to know that here's a question. Do you think there are more military personnel?
My point is that you actually don't know. That's why you're making this point. So Kentucky is often used because people like to go after Rand Paul on this, and it turns out the bulk of this federal welfare spending supposedly that's going to the state of Kentucky goes to exorbitantly large military bases, which represent a larger portion of a small state like Kentucky's budget as compared if you were to put Fort Knox into the state of California. Again, I'm not sure what is so hard to understand about this. You understand that 10,000 soldiers in small state of under 1 million population, like in theory, would be a bigger percentage of that state's economy than in the state of California, which has 38 million people. Like that should be pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I'll look up this, but I don't know. I'm looking up like Kentucky's largest spending areas per capita, where the number 1 is public welfare, number 2 is K through 12 education, number 3 is health and hospitals, number 4 is
Is that
higher
from the
education.
Kentucky state budget? Obviously, the Kentucky state budget is going to be there.
So you're telling me that I'm going to try to find the exact amount of money spent on military bases in Kentucky. I'm curious, do you think that if we equalize from military spending, do you think that's going to significantly change the amount of federal investment if we adjusted that on a per capita, that's going to significantly change the amount of federal investment between blue states and red states?
Oh, for sure, yeah.
Okay.
I don't think it's going to.
It's a novel economic theory that I've never heard positive from anybody in my entire life.
I think you'll probably, because there are definitely poorer red states. I think you'll probably end up with more red states on the top or the bottom of the list, depending on how you're counting it. But it won't be so glaring by comparison. So yeah, it's definitely going to shake up the order significantly.
Gotcha.
And the only reason I know this is because I remember this being specifically argued against Rand Paul about the state of Kentucky.
I'm sure Rand Paul has said it, but I...
No, it was argued as a way to insult Rand Paul, and then when people looked into the state of Kentucky, this is what they found.
Interesting. Okay. Also, as a quick thing, I did look up what Sean said, and I can see that the federal funds that were spent in Kentucky, 3 is the Department of Agriculture at $2 billion, 2 is the Department of Veteran Affairs at $2.5 billion, and then 1 is the Department of Defense at $8.3 billion. So...
I'm out of here.
I'm just kidding, actually. Department of Defense was number 3 at $8.3 billion. 2 was the Social Security Administration at $19 billion. And 1 was the Department of Health and Human Services at $116 billion. So the idea that military bases are what's playing into Kentucky's absorption of federal funds is bullshit. And Kentucky was your go-to example, so I'm guessing this is probably the most extreme one you could find. So that's bullshit.
This is nonsense. We have a ton of spending on healthcare in the United States and Social Security. But you're talking about welfare spending in particular. Are you counting Social Security and Medicare as welfare?
I'm saying that the federal funds that are absorbed by Kentucky and spent on things like this are not primarily going to...
How much does Health and Human Services go to these other places?
I don't know, but I know that blue states pay more in federal tax receipts, federal funds tax receipts, or federal tax receipts than they get back on average versus red states that tend to absorb more because, as you said,
have to go into my Google machine right now.
More sparsely populated. Red states don't have the same level of economic prosperity as cities do. Not to any fault of rural people, but they just tend to not produce as much economic activity.
I'm going to have to go into my Google machine now, too. Did you hear the other question?
I appreciate that, Destiny.
All right, bye.
Remember to hit that like and subscribe, and don't forget the notification bell so that my videos show up right in your feed.